So hey there, everybody. Got a spot of a lecture for us to get into on the influence of revolutionary ideals, talking about how that influence is felt within the United States in terms of just greater levels of equality, the beginnings of an abolition movement, the initial changes to the status of women in American society, and then also taking a look at how these ideals are going to spread to new areas in other parts of the world. So here we go. Okay, so when we talk about the influence of revolutionary ideals, and we talk about the increased awareness of inequalities in society, this is kind of like where it turns to the debate surrounding some of the idealistic language that kind of comes out of the Declaration of Independence. That if you really do believe that all men are created equal and that all men have rights, does that mean all white men, all property owning men? Does it mean men and women? And the answer to that question resonates differently to different groups of people. So what you see as a general movement through this time period is that there is a steady movement towards anti-aristocratic, pro-egalitarian, thought processes and a distrust of distant authority. So anti-aristocratic means more so like noble aristocracy is just really not a thing that has been present in the colonial system, and it's not going to be present in the United States either. So if you're going to be anti-aristocratic, the idea that you are against somebody being a superior in society just based on the status of their birth, that makes you pro-egalitarian. If you're an egalitarian, it means you believe in a level of equality that is true across the board. And so this is something that is present in the language of the Declaration of Independence. And then throughout all of this revolutionary movement, there has been just a general distrust of distant authority that's been developed because the distant authority of the British has been kind of violating people's rights. And that is something that is there as part of like the protest in the 1760s and 1770s. This is not really what the consequence of the revolutionary movement was supposed to be. This is unintended. I think that you can make an argument that for the colonial elites, the businessmen, whether it's Sam Adams or John Hancock or even Jefferson and Washington, that it was about just sort of breaking away from the British rule and having a level of self-government. But this goes beyond the idea of just breaking away from the British rule. Is breaking away from all levels of distant authority, which means you begin to see some calls for a greater level of democracy, more people involved in the decision-making process. And you see this develop itself somewhat in the new state and national governments and the Articles of Confederation, and then again in the Constitution. And so we will start talking about the level of democracy that exists in American society. I almost said colonial, but that's in the past now. In American society, how much democracy is going to be there. The idea was starting to run stronger in some areas, but it was basically that local rule was going to be the dominant version. So the Articles of Confederation are purposely set up weak. Local rule, as far as your local communities or as far as your state government, they're trying to emphasize civic duty and public virtue. The idea that everybody has a role to play in this public developmental process, because if you are going to be pro democracy or if you're going to be pro egalitarian, this is something that is going to be a long-term trend in American history, but you're seeing it develop in pockets here as early as 1776. Probably the best example of this is what you get out of the earliest of the abolition movements, anti-slavery, the abolishing of slavery in the United States. Pre-war colonial America, there's no real serious conversation happening about abolishing slavery in any of the colonies. In all 13 colonies, chattel slavery was legal and institutionalized and part of their social structure. But once you get out of the Revolutionary War, as early as like the late 1770s, early 1780s, abolition begins to take a stand in some areas as a political position. Because how can you believe all men are created equal if you also believe that it is acceptable to enslave an entire class or entire race of people? The first two states where you see these abolition movements come out are in Vermont, and in their original state constitution in 1777, Vermont, banned slavery within their state boundaries. And then in the second Pennsylvania Constitution in 1780, they take a stand towards gradual emancipation of slavery and the gradual abolition. So we'll see more on the slavery topic in a later section of notes on this unit. But here, so far as the revolutionary ideals, this is absolutely a change that's happening because of some of the revolutionary sentiment and the democratic sentiment that comes out of places like the Declaration of Independence. Some of the same conversations about egalitarianism and equality in society is going to be applied into conversations about the role of women in society. During the colonial period, it is a very patriarchal society where women are seen as being a family supportive role only, not really much of a voice in the public sphere. But during the revolutionary movement itself, there is a greater participation of women kind of in public circles, whether that means boycott activism for the Daughters of the Revolution or the Daughters of Liberty, or if that means helping out with the wartime economy. While men went to go fight in the war, their wives and sisters and mothers were left in charge of maintaining an economic status. Whereas, like, if it's a family farm, they take over control in the farm. There are examples of women that are actively involved in military operations, either as spies, there's the espionage on here, or what they called camp followers. Camp followers sometimes served as cooks or nurses and occasionally served in battle conditions. And so this is something that during the revolutionary process, you kind of see this slow development over those few years. You add into this the Enlightenment ideas of tyranny versus freedom. That if you're going to talk about the tyranny of a distant government or the giving somebody freedom over the conduct of their lives, this gets to lead to questions about the role and the status of women, because within household situations, some women felt it was a tyrannical situation where their freedoms were being limited. And if this is happening in a family situation, well, maybe there should be consideration given by the government to protect women in those tyrannical household situations, which leads to Abigail Adams writing a letter to her husband John Adams, who was helping to co-author the Declaration of Independence and serving in the Second Continental Congress. Abigail Adams is his wife, and in the course of correspondence back and forth, she writes a letter to him and basically says, John, remember the ladies in these conversations, that women have rights too, and those rights need to be protected and regarded. It is a sign that this is an issue that needed to be brought up because Abigail Adams raises the issue. It is also a sign that this is not going to be a real game-changing issue because there is no conversation that happens about women's rights through the course of the Continental Congress or even in the early Articles of Confederation or even in the early U.S. Constitution. And so this is going to be an awareness of this situation, but it is going to be something where it's going to take time for this kind of progress to really be seen. What you get at this particular moment in time is a concept called Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood is the idea that women should teach Republican values within the family. So whether it's the democratic, pro-egalitarian values that we saw on the previous slide, or if it's just really about the ideas of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, women as the mothers and caregivers to the family, this type of moral education, the idea was like women have that responsibility within the home. which is a limited responsibility that they're being allowed to have, but it's vital for the growth of a democracy because this is giving women a greater level of importance in American political culture. In British colonial political culture, this didn't exist because those ideas didn't exist. The ideas of tyranny and freedom weren't really discussed the same way that they're being discussed now. And so this is something where women are getting an increased role in these conversations. But again, these are still familial conversations. So in order for these changes to be fully realized, there's an awareness that women are going to need to have more access to education and intellectual development. That if you're going to get women to be able to have a more public persona in society, one of the necessary steps is going to be changes to the education system, higher education, which, for the most part, there are only men that are able to go to college, and that is starting to change during the early years of the Republic. So, big picture on this is that during the revolutionary period, the role of women stays largely the same. Household caregivers, but the status in those roles is becoming more elevated, where it's like that household caregiver is now evolving to include things like a moral education when it comes down to, well, Republican government and political democracy. And finally, on a global perspective, the influence of revolutionary ideals is going to be an inspiration for future independence movements, both during this time period and really for decades and centuries to come. Most directly, it is going to be an inspiration for the French Revolution starting in 1789, where they will overthrow the absolute monarchy of King Louis XVI. This represents for France a rejection of the divine right of kings and a movement towards this republican government that the United States is really kind of espousing. But for factors that are beyond the scope of this class, the French Revolution is going to be complicated. It's going to have a multiple layers to it. There's going to be mixed results to it. And ultimately, by the time the French Revolution is over, they're still under a monarchy. Closer to home, starting in the 1790s, as kind of an offshoot of the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution starts, where as a French colony, Haiti. I mean, they institute a. I mean, it's a revolt of enslaved people that are fighting against French rule. And Toussaint Louverture, there he is. He is the real kind of organizer, military leader of this movement. So the Haitian Revolution represents the first successful and the largest successful slave revolt in the history of the Western Hemisphere. They are going to rebel against French rule and they're going to establish themselves as an independent nation in 1804. Because of their status as a successful slave revolt nation, the United States is going to take a very cold relationship to them. While this represents an extension of revolutionary ideals, it also represents a challenge to slavery, which is something that the American leadership is not really willing to embrace, which is why, well, Haiti's relations with the United States are going to be very slow in development, and actually the U.S. will not establish diplomatic relations with them until 1862, which, if you're tracking your dates, you probably are aware that's in the middle of the Civil War. So it is not going to be until like the end of slavery in the United States that you see an extension of diplomatic relations to Haiti. And then on the mainland continent of the Americas, there's the beginning of a Latin American series of revolutions against Spanish colonial rule, starting with Mexico. As early as 1810, you're seeing a revolutionary movement against Mexican rule, ultimately leading to Mexican independence in 1821. Probably the most instrumental figure in this in Spanish America is going to be Simón Bolivar, who through the 1820s is going to have a role to play in independence movements in countries like Colombia and Venezuela and Ecuador and Peru and Bolivia, and he is seen as being one of the George Washington founding father kind of figures across Latin America, up to the point that even here in Texas, the Bolivar Peninsula is named after after Simon Bolivar. The nation, the country of Bolivia in South America is named after him. And so there is this ongoing, sort of recognition of the role that he played, but there's also an ongoing recognition of the role that the Declaration of Independence plays in the extension of revolutionary ideals beyond the idea of just white owning males were going to be guaranteed of their rights, and seeing those same idealistic principles being extended into new areas in many different directions.